So hi, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Evelyn Moon. I'm Director of Education at Good Grief, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to spend some time with you all today. And I'm just sending immense gratitude for your attention, for your presence, and also grateful for our wonderful presenter. Today's session is part of our Good Grief Schools webinar series. Every school year, we bring you content, experts, and information just as a way to extend the work that we do and our advocacy outside of our centers and into this virtual space. Just so you know, anyone who's attended today's live session will receive a certificate of attendance within about the next 48 or so hours. Before we get going, why don't y'all open up the chat, make sure that you have it set to everyone, and just let us know where you're from. If you're from a school, another org, a particular region, just like to see who's all in the room. So sound off. I know we've got some good griefers. Oh, we got Texas. Hey, Delaware Valley High School, what's up? Oh, hear that. Yep, they're all rolling in. Welcome, Seattle. Hey, Campfire Circle in Toronto. Yes, I'm seeing some familiar names. Yeah, keep it going, keep it going. Oh, it's so fun. So for those of you who are maybe new to Good Grief, because I see a lot of familiar names, but maybe some that I haven't yet met or interacted with, but we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around in New Jersey since 2004, and this is our mission. Good Grief builds resilience in children, strengthens families, and empowers communities to grow from loss and adversity. So for most of the organization's history, we've been providing free and unlimited peer support programs to grieving children and families. We say we go as young as 3 up to 30, so to young adulthood. And we do this in our centers, one in Morristown and one in Princeton. But in recent years, our work has been expanding into some other areas. Let me just show you a quick slide. This is sort of the big picture. We have our Nights of Support, our family support services, and Good Grief Schools. That's where I spend the bulk of my time. So we have a grief support program in schools called Good Grief Groups, a resilience building program called Roots to Resilience. We do parent and caregiver education, as well as professional development and training for schools. We also do our Grief Expression Summer Camp. We already had people calling and looking for some interest in that. We had an in-person camp last August. I believe it's happening again, also in August, so more to come on that. Our Good Grief Spring Institute, that is a big event that is coming up next month, March 19th, and I think it'll be a great segue after today's session talking about adverse childhood experiences. But enough about me and enough about Good Grief. I want to talk about our presenter today. So it is my honor and my privilege to welcome Dr. Christina Liparini, PhD. She's a licensed psychologist and a licensed professional counselor based out of New Jersey. She's been an adjunct faculty at Seton Hall University for the past 15 years, training graduate students for careers as school counselors and mental health counselors. And she's provided counseling services and psychoeducation to individuals across the entire lifespan. So throughout her clinical work and teaching, she underscores the power of relationships and empathy in the change process. She's also a mom, so she's a mother of 2, and she's a friend of Good Grief. She is a Good Grief volunteer facilitator. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm very proud to be a friend of Good Grief, and also happy to see some of my friends in our participants today, including some of my former graduate students, including some that I know are on track to get involved with Good Grief. So thank you for having me. And it's my pleasure to really talk about this topic today. It's a difficult topic, but one that is so necessary. As I saw everyone talking about their roles in the chat, it applies to all of us. I think the topic of adverse childhood experiences applies to all of us as human beings. And it's really underscored the last couple of years just how much we're all touched by trauma. So I'm really happy to have the chance to talk to you all today. And I'm just going to get started with the presentation and let you know that I'm giving a little bit of background on ACEs because we all might be in a little bit of different position of previous knowledge. So we'll do a little quick overview, and then we'll talk more about what research is telling us, including what's still coming out. It's a really exciting field. Okay. And we can see my screen? Okay.
Yep, we see you.
All right. Important to ask before I'm 10 slides in. Okay. So as Evelyn mentioned, I am adjunct faculty at Seton Hall University, which is really what piqued my interest about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I teach routinely every year. I will teach at least 1 or 2 sections of human development across the lifespan. And it used to be ACEs got a page or a half a page in our human development text. And over recent years and recent editions, I've noticed that it started to get more of a spread and a little more coverage and a little more about neuropsychology and about everything we're learning about neuroplasticity. So the section was expanding, and I started to delve into it a little bit more, just wondering for myself, my family, how ACEs applies to our health, our mental and physical health, and realizing that there's so much that we as a population just don't know about this topic. And there's so many opportunities for prevention and intervention that I think are pretty user friendly. So I'm hoping that all of you today will be able to come away from this presentation with some tools, something that you feel you can apply, whether it's in your personal or professional life. So it's my hope that you feel like there's something you can take away and immediately bring to your family, your friends, or students served. So let's talk a little bit about the background of ACEs. So what are ACEs? So, we love acronyms in psychology. So ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences. And this really started to come into our vocabulary in the 1990s, late 90s, after Kaiser Permanente Health System had done a study of thousands of their patients. They were wondering why some patients continued to really struggle and why they were seeing some patients with multiple health conditions and really poor outcomes. And by studying their early experiences, they found that the more of these adverse childhood experiences that they had, the more their later health was impacted, both physical and mental. And poor outcomes included up to a 20-year shorter lifespan or life expectancy. So this was really jarring data for researchers to grapple with, and obviously had a lot of repercussions when thinking about the impact that trauma was having on our health. Now, with a critical eye, we can look back on this research, which was done in 95 to 97, and ask a little bit more about the clients or the patients that were used. It was a middle-class population, primarily white. And an important thing nowadays to note is everybody that was in this study had health insurance, right? So this is truly not fully representative of the everyday experience. So as the study was replicated and expanded in later years, we found out that the results were even more jarring, especially for people of color, of their health outcomes. So let's start by taking a look at what they considered back in those 90s as far as those adverse childhood experiences. So there were 10 areas that they considered for trauma. Does anybody want to take a guess and put something in the chat? What do you think was considered a trauma? I would give you candy if we were live for participating. Do we have any guesses, Evelyn?
We've got a few coming in. We've got divorce. Oh, they're really rolling. Divorce, death, abuse, witnessing violence, job loss, substance abuse of a parent, pet death, neglect, moving, sickness, serious illness, domestic abuse, poverty.
Okay. So the floodgates open, right? It's not too hard to think of trauma, of what is trauma. So let's take a look at what researchers grouped, again, by their data in the 95, 97, and they came up with these areas. So obviously different types of abuse, which were mentioned. So we're looking at physical, sexual, emotional abuse, different forms of neglect. I will give them credit definitely for considering emotional neglect and neglect in general, as we look at the top 10 trauma areas in the 90s. And then we're looking at household dysfunction. So some of the things that were mentioned, like divorce or maltreatment, witnessing domestic violence in the household. But clearly, as you all just pointed out, not fully inclusive, right? We can all think of other things that we would add to this. So that's the benefit of time and future research and people who remain curious about this, of looking at what else we could consider ACEs. So here we are today, looking at our all these different areas that impact us. So clearly more than just those first 10 areas, right? So when I've talked about this with other groups before, they hone in on that hurricane or tornado and they say that's what the last couple of years have felt like. But yes, look at all the different environmental things that impact us, like natural disasters, right? Tornadoes, hurricanes, storms. In the past year, we've had storms that have, wiped out parts of communities, rebuilding again. In New Jersey, we've had our share of, storms and rebuilding. That also then has impact in other areas, like economic insecurity. So then we look at all those different areas within the community, looking at things like poverty, food scarcity, things that our students or our young people that we're serving, we see this with them. Not to also forget racism, institutionalized racism, witnessing acts that are race-based, of violence that's race-based. So there are a lot of different areas. And then of course, more focused on where our research started, that household area, things we're seeing in the home, including divorce, mental illness, abuse, but also looking at things like depression. If one or both caregivers are experiencing depression, the impact that would have on the child. So when we're talking about ACEs, we're talking about stressful events that happen before the age of 18. That's not to say that events after the age of 18 don't impact us, but the earlier events really, they're more hardwired because of the developing person. When you think about the developing brain, the developing pathways, the developing systems, it has more of a physiological impact as well. So what is the impact? When you are exposed to these adverse childhood experiences or events, what kind of impact does that have? Again, it's that same finding of up to a 20-year decrease in life expectancy. And then they found more recently that it impacts things like likelihood of developing alcoholism by up to 7.4 times as likely if somebody's experienced 4 or more ACEs. And also more than 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. For those of us working in the school system as either teachers, school counselors, school social workers, in the school system, we might see an increased likelihood of repeating a grade, increased absenteeism. And looking at juvenile offenders, we're seeing that they're 4 times more likely to actually have an increase in those ACEs. So if we look at the cutoff of 3 or more ACEs, that's when we start to see poorer outcomes, of significantly poorer. And speaking of 3 or more, the age of 3, another startling statistic is that 50% of ACEs are acquired by the age of 3. That means by the time a lot of us are coming in contact with young people, they've already experienced trauma. And at that point, it's not prevention, but intervention. So what else are we seeing? And what are we seeing kind of a breakdown by different age brackets for people that have experienced ACEs? For babies, again, in those first 3 years, or especially when in infancy, the failure to thrive, growth delay, disrupted sleep, and failing to meet developmental milestones. For school-age children, which is probably where a lot of us are, the kids that are frequently sick, asthma, pneumonia, viral infections, and also then again, difficulties with learning and behavior. For adolescents, we're seeing high-risk behaviors. It could lead to teen pregnancy, substance abuse, mental health disorders. And also, I know we have at least one school nurse in our audience today. Those might be the frequent flyers that are coming down to the nurse's office with somatic complaints, kind of generalized, or there's no real physical cause that you can find, or it's just kind of an ongoing nagging symptom. That might be related to trauma. Okay. So here are some areas that didn't make the cut when we talked about the first round of ACEs identified by researchers back in the late 90s. So as we saw on that picture, there are a lot of other areas and even more. Like if we were just to sit together and brainstorm, we would find even more areas. Things like homelessness, parental deployment, military deployment, frequent moves, right? And disability, being overweight, victimization, no good friends, bullying, things that I think schools are paying more attention to, but I think it's a different weight when we start to identify it as a trauma. A lot of times we think as trauma has to be trauma with a capital T, but the little t's add up as well for us, right? So we might minimize and say, well, everybody got bullied a little bit, or it seemed like almost everybody's parents were divorced, but it's still a little t. The impact it might have on one person versus another, we'll talk in a little bit about, but again, not to minimize it and to explore that. Okay, and very close to the mission of Good Grief, when we're looking at trauma, someone close to the child has died because of an accident or illness, or just someone close to them has been in an accident and is not well. Maybe they're in recovery or they have permanent disability from the injury or accident. So let's talk a little bit about COVID. COVID as a trauma. Why do you think COVID might be classified as a trauma? Should it be? Yes, isolation, absolutely. So it's not the fact, collective trauma, absolutely. It's not the fact that it's just COVID. It's like, what did that lead to that could be traumatic? Absolutely. Life turned upside down, loss of normalcy. Absolutely. We're still trying to figure out normal, right? I just got an email that my workplace come Tuesday, masks are no longer mandatory. And although that might feel like a step forward, again, it's trying to grapple with, well, what are things going to look like now? What's our new normal? Loss of autonomy. Oh, control. I love the word control. I think that hits home for a lot of us living with fear. I think anxiety thrives on that lack of control. And here we are living, now for a couple of years with that lack of control. So yeah, death. Lisa, thank you for bringing up that there's death happening during COVID. So yeah, absolutely. So if we look at why, again, also just Peggy makes a great point too about kind of different viewpoints, differing sides, sometimes very vocal and not necessarily respectful of one another as we're talking about ways to approach the pandemic and protocols. So again, even societally, that we don't have a united front can cause a lot of anxiety in us as adults that is then passed on to young people. If any of you here are parents, you know that children hear far more than we think they do. A lesson that I learned early on in the pandemic as my husband and I would report to each other each day on what we were hearing. Now there's this many cases and I heard this, not realizing that our third grader was picking up bits and pieces and filling in the gaps and coming to some pretty inaccurate conclusions. Although we didn't have a lot of information, his was clearly not accurate. And resulted in my son who did not want to leave the house for months. We could get him on the trampoline in the backyard and that was the best we could get. So again, the fear, the sense that even your primary caregivers aren't sure what's going on, that's traumatic. The loss of school from one day to the next, the loss of a social network for our kids, no longer seeing their classmates, and keeping in mind that for some of our children, going to school or going to after school programs, those were positive connections that they lost. They might have been the only positive connections that they had. Now, when I'm reading information about where we are with the pandemic and with mental health, researchers saying right now we're just getting to put our eyes back on our most, at-risk kids. That they've been on their own for a while or are virtual, and it's been really hard to keep track of how they're doing. Nothing kind of beats that in-person interaction as far as assessing someone. So finally being able to do that after a longer period of time. So let's talk about some of the statistics that are coming out about COVID as a trauma. I think we can make a strong case just based off our chat of a lot of reasons why it would be trauma, including, as someone mentioned, death related to COVID. So for every four COVID-19 deaths, there's a child that loses a parent or caregiver. So for every 4 COVID deaths, somebody is losing one of their caregivers, a child. From the time I started doing this presentation in the early fall to now, my statistics have changed as far as how many children have lost a primary or second caregiver due to the pandemic. It was closer to 140,000, and now we're up to 167,000 children who've lost a primary or secondary caregiver. So yes, the CDC has now jumped on board and validated that the pandemic is a source of traumatic stress. It is an ACE. So there's no way around that, which brings us to also talking about the context in general that our young people are in already, that multiple agencies, including government offices such as the Surgeon General, are declaring this a national emergency for child and adolescent mental health. Things were not good before, and things are even worse now due to the disruption and the enormous amount of adversity they and their family have experienced as a result of the pandemic. And then when we break it down further and we talk about racial differences, it's important for us to note that communities of color have taken more of the brunt, borne more of the impact of COVID infections and deaths. They've also been more subject to economic hardships during the pandemic. And because of that, if we look at them being more subject to infections and deaths, children of racial and ethnic minorities are accounting for 65% of those who have lost a caregiver during the pandemic. So they're 4.5 times more likely to lose that parent or grandparent who has a prominent role in their lives compared to their white counterparts. So Black children were almost 2.5 times more likely, and Hispanic children were nearly 2 times more likely than their white counterparts. Okay. All right. So what do we do? What do we do knowing that our young people are experiencing trauma? What do we know? What do we do with what we know? So the good news is we have better instruments to assess for trauma than we used to. We look for more than those 10 things. We now have instruments like the 2 that I have on the screen here that they've broadened the definition of trauma. So they're asking about far more areas. And they're also asking caregivers as well as the children or teens, their experiences. So now we're getting more data, right? Not just from one person, but multiple people in that system with different points of view telling us about what adverse childhood experiences they are seeing in that young person. So it could be self-report or by a caregiver. And we're also seeing these measures in different languages and validated across different cultures. So they're just better instruments that are more inclusive in their design and then in their ability to be used to plan. Okay. So some things to keep in mind when you're using one of these instruments. So if Evelyn and I were both given an ACEs instrument to see what our ACEs score is, Evelyn and I both might have a 4, right? But Evelyn's 4 could look really different than my 4. So the kind of the severity of our experience with each one needs to be taken into account. And really, when you're doing these assessments, it's not like a Cosmo quiz where I'd say to Evelyn, "Oh, I got a 4. I'm really out of luck here. Like, this is going to be bad. I better start planning, end of life care." No, what it means is it's supposed to be taking more of a temperature of a community. So if Evelyn and I are part of the same community and lots of people in the community were given these assessments, it would give us some sort of temperature on what's going on in the community and help us figure out what might be important steps to take to address this systemically, not just on the individual level. So as you think about maybe using an instrument with students to assess for ACEs, keep in mind it's a launching point for discussion and learning about someone's experiences. It is not deterministic. It is a launching point. Okay. And not getting too caught up in the number. Again, it's giving us a starting point, but that is not the end point. When you're talking about ACEs with someone, you want to make sure that it takes place within a relationship that feels safe. Asking only as much as you need to, and that the person is clearly comfortable sharing, because we don't want to, have them re-experiencing trauma or triggers. We don't need to ask for all the details. Part of our goal is to empower folks. So if they don't want to volunteer details, it's not our job to push for details and to leave them feeling vulnerable. After doing an assessment or even talking about ACEs in a more informal way, it's important to always leave with that person with some sense of tools or empowerment. It's just like when I do therapy, when I have a session, I'm always watching the clock because I don't want someone leaving a session feeling like the wound is open. Okay, we've acknowledged the wound, we've started to address it, but let's leave the session, or let's leave this discussion talking about ways that the person can feel empowered. Simple ways, like how are you going to manage your stress response? Let's talk about the power of deep breathing. Let's talk about different ways that you find are helpful for coping. What are your personal strengths? How can you use those? How have you dealt with adversity before? Wow, you've dealt with a lot of adversity. What's worked for you? Okay. These are ways to buffer the effects of that toxic stress and empower the individual. And all of you here, I'm sure in some capacity can relate to the idea of burnout or compassion fatigue. You're all at this workshop today because you care about young people. And that is a beautiful thing. And that motivates you to do great work, but it also leaves us prone to burnout and vicarious traumatization. That's another workshop, or I think that could be a workshop series and a different topic altogether. But to be aware, if you're working with students who've experienced a number of ACEs and you're working, to create a trauma informed environment, we need to take care of ourselves. Easier said than done, but just being aware when we're being triggered and when we're starting to think about our own experiences and our own reactions rather than the person sitting in front of us. All right, so I don't know about any of you, but I think Dr. Maya Angelou was a phenomenal woman. She, has written about phenomenal women, right? Most of us here know of Maya Angelou. Most of us know of her friend Oprah. Yes. So I listened to a ton of podcasts, and over the summer, I was in the car and I was listening to a podcast from the History Chicks. And the History Chicks covered different famous women in history. And they covered Maya. And I was just taken aback by all of her accomplishments, right? All this woman has done. So back to the chat. Quick quiz, no searching, just off the top of your head, y'all. What do you know about Dr. Maya Angelou? Besides, you can't say her birth and death dates and that she was a doctor. But besides that, what else do you know about Dr. Maya Angelou? Author, yep. Keep it coming. Yeah, Naomi, you're right. Ooh, she was a poetry teacher at Rebecca's College. I love Chris's phrase, social justice warrior. Absolutely. She was a poet, an activist, leader, yes. She was all of those things. She was a real firecracker. When I think of Maya Angelou, I think of her voice. Like I feel it. I don't just hear it. I feel it, the reverberations of that voice. She had a powerful voice that she used in poetry, in autobiographical works. She had over 50 honorary degrees. That's pretty good. Yes, Still I Rise. I gifted her cookbook to my sister-in-law, And my sister-in-law weeps every time she makes Maya's lemon meringue pie, because she also hears Maya's voice and reads this story related to the pie. She is a storyteller. She was a dancer, a singer too. This was an artist, right? And an activist. She really used her voice, right? But what else? She was also Marguerite Johnson. And someone mentioned what they knew about Marguerite Johnson, that she was a survivor of sexual abuse. What else do we know about Marguerite? So let's think about this little girl, probably around 6 or 7 in this picture, and that she, before the age of 18, she definitely racked up some aces. Does anybody know any of her story? Yeah. Bonus extra credit points for Kelly. Yeah, she stopped talking, which I think is one of the things that just stopped me in my tracks, because I told you, I think of her voice. But yet, at the age of 7, or around 7.5, she was sexually assaulted by her mother's boyfriend. And she ultimately told her brother, not uncommon, her abuser told her if she told anybody, he would kill her brother. So she was terrified, but ultimately she needed medical attention as a result of the assault. And her mother and her brother obviously saw, and her uncle saw, that she needed medical attention. So she did get medical attention for that, and she did name the perpetrator, and she had to testify. So this little girl had to testify. And when she testified, she named him, and he was jailed for a year. But somehow that night he was released. And when he was released, her uncles, her maternal uncles, she lived with her mother, but her, maternal family was nearby. Her grandmother, her maternal grandmother, was really tight with the police. She was considered a warden. So she really could get the vote out in the Black community. So the police were really tight with her. And it seems they most likely looked the other way when her perpetrator was kicked to death by probably several men, most likely her uncles. Now, in Marguerite's mind, she caused that to happen. She named him. She believed that her words, her voice caused somebody to die. And so for several years, she did not speak. Teachers tried to literally beat it out of her words. But thankfully, we look at the flip side, and Marguerite had her mama Annie, her paternal grandmother in Arkansas, that she got to live with, and a whole community that respected that there was a reason for her mutism. So let's talk about the things that helped Marguerite grow into Maya. She had a brother who she loved fiercely and who loved her back. She had Mama Annie in Arkansas. She had her uncle, Uncle Willie. She also had Mrs. Flowers. So Mrs. Flowers was this sophisticated woman on the Black side of town in Arkansas, where she lived with her brother and her maternal grandmother for periods of time. And when she went back there after the sexual assault to live with her grandmother again, she got to meet Mrs. Flowers and help her with chores. And Mrs. Flowers started sharing books with her and telling her how to read out loud, that books are different when you read out loud. And wouldn't you know, Maya's voice came back and she began to write. So Maya had a lot of trauma, including a sexual assault, her parents divorcing when she was 2 years of age, being sent on a train with her brother from California to Arkansas at the age of 3, with no caregiver and just a note pinned to her shirt of who she was supposed to go to. And then back and forth some more with different caregivers. But she had amazing people in her life, right? So she had a Mama Annie, she had her brother. She also had, besides people, she had books. She had outlets. So when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, the next piece I want to talk to you about is the other piece of the equation that's so important, which is the positive experiences that offset or buffer the trauma. Okay, so there's lots of different ways we can assess those, lots of different measures. And for those of you who are interested in the measures, I know Evelyn is recording this and you can take a closer look at them. But these measures are great because they're called counter ACEs, right? The protective factors. So looking at all the supports and strengths that this individual has within themselves and their community to support them. So we have to not just look at the factors that contribute to risk, but also the factors that contribute to resilience, right? Which is a lot of the work of Good Grief too. How do we tap into resilience, especially with our schools-based programs and initiatives? How do we foster resilience? So by doing these assessments, we start identifying what the student already has going for them, what the caregivers identify as already helpful, and then we can build upon that, right? Because everybody has strengths. No matter how dire their situation, there are strengths to foster or create, things we can put in place. So that's really the main point I want you to take away, is that it's not just about the good or the bad, but also the good that people have in their lives, right? So not every Marguerite will turn into Dr. Maya Angelou, but with support, look what can happen, right? So if we looked at Maya and counted them up, she probably had, 4 or 5 ACEs just off the top of our heads we're looking at. But she also was buffered, the effects of those traumas were buffered by all these protective factors. Okay. So there's lots of different measures we can use. So it's not just those ACEs measures talking about trauma, but look what else we can ask about. Things like, well, growing up, did you have at least one good friend, some good neighbors, somebody you could go to, a parent, somebody, adult, not a parent, that you could ask for support or advice? Where did you get to feel comfortable with yourself? Did you get to have a good time? Where would you have a good time? Right? So we want to talk about that as well. Okay. Did you have routine, whether it was at school or at home? Where did you feel safe? Where was there predictability? Because we know, even especially in the pandemic, wherever we could put structure and predictability created some sense of normalcy, buffering the effects of the pandemic. So these are things we can ask about. So our goal is really to shift from thinking about things in a punitive way. So when we see somebody experiencing behavioral disruption that may be an outgrowth of trauma, instead of getting punitive of we need to punish them, we need to talk about how we can be protective. What's going on? We have to get curious, like what is going on with this person? And as I just mentioned, we need to move from the deficits perspective to strengths. I spent the first 7 years of my career while I was going through graduate school, working in a residential treatment program with children who've been abused. And there was a psychologist who consulted with us at the group home or the residential treatment program. And she was this beautiful, majestic, powerful Black woman who came in and not just taught us about trauma, but she also taught us about things like how to care for hair that was different than ours, right? Like all the nuts and bolts, because basic needs need to be met for folks too. But she also, I remember one time did an in-service with us about strengths. And she said, I know these kids, some of these kids here are pushing your buttons and their guard is up, but they all have strengths. You may have to search more deeply with some than others, but they all have strengths. And there were a couple kids that, yes, I had to dig really deep, but they had strengths too. And that's what helps us stay in the game with them and build relationship, and also help them see their strengths and leverage them. So I mentioned Oprah, as I mentioned Maya before, because Oprah loved Maya very much and featured her in her Soul series and lots of things. Now, Oprah has recently had some discussions with Dr. Bruce Perry about trauma. And he's written a book, I believe it's called What Happened to You? So it's changing the conversation related to trauma from, well, what's wrong with you that you act this way, to getting curious and getting soft and compassionate of what happened to you? Like, what have you gone through? From a more judgmental, why are you like this, to I want to understand how you are the way you are. What's brought you to this point? Because our toughest kids, and I'm sure all of you here can think of somebody tough, there's a reason they're that way. Right? Hard to keep in mind sometimes when they're pushing your buttons. But again, if we can get soft and curious and think about what have you gone through, it will serve us and them better. So Nadine Burke-Harris has talked a lot and written a lot about trauma. She's done a great TED Talk on ACEs, which I encourage you all to check out. She's got great information on her website, and she has created the Burke Foundation. Lots of ideas about simple things we can do to foster a nurturing environment for our students or young people who've experienced trauma. And one of those things is, again, to tap into their goals, their dreams, their strengths. Especially as we're coming out of the pandemic and things are opening up again, we have the opportunity to encourage young people to engage in extracurricular activities again, whatever they may be. You may need to get creative. I have a son who does not like doing organized sports, and I'm not going to try to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's just not going to happen. I see his strengths, and he is going to be going to Seton Hall's esports camp this summer because he is a gamer and he's good at it, and he's funny, and he's learning how to stream videos and have a YouTube channel that we of course monitor, but he's learning skills, right? And he's making friends through that, both in the virtual world, again, very monitored, but we're also connecting him to his peers who enjoy the same things through camp, through different activities in town or at our local YMCA. So listen, esports camp is not cheap, but there are a lot of other options when we're talking about ways to connect our young people with other young people. The YMCA routinely runs very cost-effective programming that's accessible both to members and the general public to try things out. So you don't have to make a year commitment, but connecting, students to school organizations or clubs, but also external things, getting creative. The reason why Big Brothers Big Sisters has been such a successful programming too is that they're a really successful mentoring program that also fosters a sense of a nurturing environment. So looking at after school programs for students, mentoring, I think it benefits both parties to be mentored and to be the mentee, to give back, right? To be in a different position, to be able to offer that. And again, trying to promote inter-ethnic friendships and looking at prejudice and racism we're seeing, systemically in our schools and other, organizations. Easier said than done, something to keep, on the radar. But what do we already have available to us? Okay. We have lots of things. So some of you have developed partnerships with Good Grief. So you've asked for help, which is tremendously important and something for us to model for our students. We cannot do everything alone. So working with other organizations, consulting with your peers keeps us energized with new ideas and just support for what we're doing, preventing burnout. But organizations like Good Grief offer resilience curricula to help young people. Programs like this are great because it's not an additional burden or responsibility that we're asking school staff to do and come up and create. So there's a curriculum already in place, manualized. I love a good manualized curriculum when things get busy. So again, looking at how we can promote resilience, how we can promote relaxation training. These are things you already do. You are promoting social connection, even in your relationship one-on-one with students. Things like play therapy. I know people sometimes look at counselors who are playing checkers with a young person, or parents that have kids in private therapy, and they're like, I can't believe I'm paying for my kid to play checkers. Well, we all know it's about more than checkers, right? It's about planning. It's about also just building a relationship with somebody. Okay, so checkers is great for executive functioning, chess, checkers, and lots of games. They have their place, right? Planning, impulse control, but also relationship building. Cognitive behavioral techniques are phenomenal for empowering people to manage their stress, to change behaviors where they can. Of course, we also need to acknowledge when things can't be changed by the individual. And that's when we do a lot of advocacy. And I know we all are doing that here in big and small ways for students. Bibliotherapy is a passion of mine. How we can use books to help young people. So, you know, we have lots of phenomenal books. I have a couple here, which I'll show you at the end. I love using the library. I'm a big consumer of the library. There's lots of great books out there about growth mindset and managing stress and how to breathe. We don't need to buy them all. You can go to the library and preview some. But using books where kids can safely identify with characters, fictional characters, whether they're human or bunny, is a safer way to talk about an issue, to talk about the bunny's issue rather than their own and what the bunny might be able to do. But they're taking away something, it's planting a seed for them to think about how that might work for them. So lots of great books for young adults too. I read with my son and to him sometimes, and I am struck by how more complex books have gotten with their themes, the more risks they're taking. Right now, I'm reading a book with my son about a Latino preteen who's lost his mother. She died when he was young from diabetes, and he is managing his own type 1 diabetes while he's adjusting to a new school. Wow, that's a pretty cool book. There's also a multiverse and some physics stuff going on in that book to keep him engaged, but he's being introduced to characters who are experiencing a lot of difficult things, adversity. So the last thing I had on this slide was relationship. And that's intentionally the last thing I'm going to talk about, because of course, yes, I want you to remember it's about strengths too. But I know a lot of times we all feel like we're not doing enough, right? Like I bet you came to this hoping you came with like the magic tools that would fix everything. But one of the most important and effective tools is something you already are doing, which is the relationship you are having with that individual. When we look at what creates change, the power of change in therapy and for individuals, what actually leads to change? More than 30% of change is attributable to the relationship they have developed with the other person. And that relationship instills hope and an expectancy that things might improve. So your relationship is one of the most important tools you have, and is the foundation from which these other things can add to that effect and create more buffers and resources to counter trauma. So your relationship is that framework. And I hope my graduate students, I saw at least a couple here, remembered from our first semester, from our first couple days, we started talking about the power of relationship. So even as we look at most recently published articles, journals of psychiatry, of adolescent psychiatry, across the board, everything I'm reading is talking about one thing we can all agree on right now is that relationships are key, right? So the authors of this most recent article in the Journal of Adolescent Psychiatry talked about connectedness is the starting point. It's our way out. It's not going to undo the disparities that have been simmering and have been there for generations and generations, but it's a starting point. We all need to support one another, especially in this unprecedented time. And I think many of us have realized the power of relationships over the last couple of years. And now as we join back together and are seeing our young people more, keep in mind the importance of that connection that you have, the power that has. And so I can't finish without going back to Maya and letting her have the last word.
There's an African-American song, 19th century. It says, when it looked like the sun wasn't gonna shine anymore, God put a rainbow in the clouds. Imagine. And I've had so many rainbows in my clouds. I had a lot of clouds, but I have had so many rainbows. And one of the things I do when I step up on a stage, when I stand up to translate, when I go to teach my classes, when I go to direct a movie, I bring everyone who has ever been kind to me with me. Black, white, Asian, Spanish speaking, Native American, gay, straight, everybody. I say, come with me. I'm going on the stage. Come with me, I need you now. Long dead, you see? So I don't ever feel I have no help. I've had rainbows in my clouds. And the thing to do, it seems to me, is to prepare yourself so that you can be a rainbow in somebody else's cloud. Somebody who may not look like you, may not call God the same name you call God, if they call God at all, you see? And may not eat the same dishes prepared the way you do, may not dance your dances or speak your language, but be a blessing to somebody. That's what I think.
That's what I think too. And so I leave you with that thought about the importance of relationship. And all of you are in so many different roles I see in the chat. And imagine how many students there that are carrying you with them, even when you don't see them, just like Maya talked about. They call on you, and that relationship, the picture they have of it, the internal picture, even when they're not with you. So I hope you don't minimize your role. And I thank you for coming today to learn even more about understanding your students and how you can help them. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Evelyn. And I also know that in attendance today, we have our new CEO, Teresa Schubeck. And I wanted to make room if she had anything she wanted to say. And she is another rainbow that has come into the Good Grief community.
So I've promoted her to panelist.
Okay. Not to put her on the spot, but I wanted to leave room and introduce our new CEO, who's been so gracious in welcoming me as a volunteer and making me feel valued. So thank you, Teresa.
Well, thank you. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak unexpectedly, but I want to add what a privilege it is. And the more I know and learn about our mission, and the more I learn and know about people like you, I'm certainly gratified to be here. And I want to say that last night was my first night as a facilitator. So I'll speak to you more about that, but committed group of people. And I'm so glad that everybody's here, and invite all of you to learn more from Evelyn about our many programs with Good Grief Schools. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, and you'll see I've popped into the chat a survey for our time together today. And I will wrap it up with just a few slides. I think I'll be getting everyone out of here on time. You guys are seeing the right screen? All right. So I think this ties in very nicely with today's presentation, because this is really sort of the key two pillars that Good Grief bases all of our programming in our centers, all of our programming in our schools on. It's the supportive relationships, the supportive adult relationships, but also the supportive peer-to-peer relationships, and building up those adaptive skills. So mindful awareness, emotion regulation, healthy coping, exploring your character, your purpose, building up empathy. And this is something that we do through our different programs, through our various curriculum. As I said earlier, we've got our Good Grief Groups, which is our grief support program, Roots to Resilience, which is our resilience building and social emotional learning program. We also do caregiver education and all different types of PD, but all of them build on these two key pillars of just building up those supportive relationships in a child's life and enhancing those adaptive skills to build resilience. So I've already popped this in the chat, but if you go to good-grief.org/resources, you'll find tons of handouts, tons of tip sheets. This will be on our YouTube channel, probably tomorrow. If you have any questions, I'm Evelyn with 2 N's at good-grief.org. And I also want to tell you about some upcoming events, both in person and virtual. So we have our Spring Institute coming up, which I think ties in really nicely with the themes of the day, because it's all about the impact of adverse childhood experiences, grief. We're going to look at some of the systemic issues as well that create these inequitable experiences of grief and exposure to adversity. We're going to really talk about building up resilience in children and communities. It's a really great event, and it'll be wonderful to see people in person. You can find out more at good-grief.org/events. And we have tons and tons of webinars coming up. And I don't know if this is going to translate well in the chat, but I'm going to try. But again, you could go on our website. So next month we are looking at SEL Day. In April, I'll be presenting with Alyssa, who I think I saw on here. We're going to talk about squashing those automatic negative thoughts. We have Dr. Kelly Moore of the Well Family Spot in Rutgers University presenting on sudden loss. And then we have Mandy Zucker of Inner Harbor talking about young adult grief, which I think will be great in June, thinking about those high school students who are starting to transition over to college and what we can do to best support them. But again, please take the time to fill out that survey. We really do value your input. Just so grateful for all of your time, your attention, your presence today. Thank you, Chris, for being here with us. Thank you, Teresa, for hopping on unexpectedly. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.